You reach for a small white pill this morning, swallow it with a sip of water, headache gone within the hour. The whole transaction costs you less time than it takes to boil an egg. Now rewind the clock, not by years, by roughly 2,000 centuries. Same headache, same pounding behind your eyes. But no pharmacy down the street. No doctor on call, no glowing screen to tell you it's probably nothing or possibly everything. Just a body in pain, a handful of other bodies nearby who are just as confused as you are, and a problem that isn't going away on its own. Here's a number worth sitting with. For 99.9% of the time humans have existed on this planet, there was no such thing as modern medicine. No antibiotics, no painkillers pulled from a lab, no germ theory to even explain what was happening beneath the skin. And yet somehow, against odds that should have wiped us out 100 times over, we made it. We didn't just survive, we multiplied, spread across continents, and eventually built the very hospitals we now complain about on the internet. So, what were people actually doing all that time? How did they handle broken bones, infected wounds, difficult births, and diseases with no name, using nothing we'd recognize as treatment today? The answer starts somewhere unglamorous. Watch an injured dog after surgery. It won't reach for gauze or antiseptic. It rests. It licks the wound. It stops eating. It searches out somewhere warm and still. That's not a decision. That's a program written into biology millions of years before humans showed up, and our earliest ancestors were running the exact same code. Rest, withdraw, heal, or don't. It worked well enough for scraped knees and minor infections, which is more or less all evolution needed it to do. But then something shifted. Something no other animal does with any real consistency. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, have been caught doing it on camera. A sick chimp will seek out a specific plant it normally avoids. Not because it tastes good, it doesn't. Some of these leaves are rough enough to physically drag parasites out of the gut on their way through. Others are bitter with compounds that are mildly toxic to the very worms making the animal ill. Nobody taught the chimp this. It simply works, and the chimp keeps doing what works. If a chimpanzee can stumble onto that, early humans almost certainly could too. Except humans had a second trick chimps never fully developed. Language, memory, teaching. A chimp that eats the right leaf gets better. A human who eats the right leaf survives, and then tells the whole cave about it starts something else entirely. Not a lucky accident, a tradition. One good observation shared at the right moment could ripple outward and save people who hadn't even been born yet. Pass it to a child. That child passes it to theirs. Repeat that for 10,000 years, and you don't get a single genius inventing medicine in a flash of insight. You get something quieter and stranger, a body of knowledge nobody personally created, built entirely out of trial, memory, and the simple refusal to let a discovery die with the person who made it. That, without any ceremony, is where medicine actually begins. And what comes next is going to sound less like folklore and more like something out of a modern operating room. In 2023, a team of archaeologists working deep in a limestone cave in Borneo uncovered a skeleton that made them stop mid-sentence. It belonged to a young hunter-gatherer who had died roughly 31,000 years ago, and part of the left leg was missing. Not lost to decay, not chewed away by scavengers. Removed. Deliberately. The cut across the bone was clean, precise. Nothing like the jagged damage of an accident. And here's the detail that changes everything. The bone had healed around the wound. New growth. Smoothed edges. Which means the amputation didn't kill the patient. They lived. Possibly for years in dense jungle on one leg, in the depths of the Ice Age. Sit with that for a second. Someone 31,000 years before antibiotics, before anesthesia, before anything resembling a hospital, looked at a person with a catastrophically damaged limb and decided the only way to save the rest of the body was to remove part of it. And then did it. And it worked. Before this discovery, the earliest confirmed amputation on record was only a few thousand years old. This single skeleton pushed the timeline of surgery back by tens of thousands of years in one afternoon. It wasn't an isolated miracle either. Dig sites scattered across nearly every inhabited continent have turned up skulls with neat, deliberate holes cut into them. Not battle wounds, not accidents. A procedure called trepanation, where a section of skull was carefully removed, likely to relieve swelling, treat seizures, or manage severe head trauma. And the detail that should genuinely unsettle you is this: a striking number of these patients survived the operation. We know because the bone had time to grow back around the opening. Brain surgery, with stone tools, in the Stone Age. And the patient walked away. New research on skulls from Peru adds an even stranger twist. Bioarchaeologists studying Andean trepanation sites found that by the later Inca period, survival rates for the procedure had climbed above 80%. Compare that to Civil War battlefield surgeons operating thousands of years later with metal instruments and a basic understanding of anatomy, whose trepanation patients survived at a noticeably lower rate. Somehow, without microscopes, without germ theory, without so much as a diagram, Andean healers had refined a skull opening procedure until it worked better than its 19th century equivalent. How did anyone learn to do this without killing everyone they practiced on? Honestly, we don't fully know. There was no textbook, no supervision, no controlled trial. There was a patient in agony, someone willing to try something drastic, and an unimaginably long, often brutal process of trial and error, stretching across generations, where the failures were buried quietly and the successes were remembered, refined, and repeated. Sometimes the evidence for this experimentation survives in stranger, more personal ways. Take Otzi, the naturally mummified traveler discovered frozen in the Alps, who lived around 5,000 years ago. Preserved on his skin are a series of tattoos, dozens of them, placed with striking precision directly over joints that scans later revealed were riddled with arthritis. Not decoration, not status symbols. Markings sitting exactly where the pain would have been worst, in patterns eerily close to the pressure points used in acupuncture practices that wouldn't be formally documented for thousands more years. He also carried a small pouch containing birch fungus, a natural compound known to fight bacteria and intestinal parasites. Whether or not Otzi fully understood why any of it worked, someone before him had figured out enough to pass the knowledge down, and he was carrying it with him when he died. None of this looked like medicine as we'd define it today. There was no theory behind most of it, no understanding of anatomy in the way a modern surgeon would recognize. But strip away the framework and what's left is unmistakable. Careful observation, dangerous experimentation, and knowledge that outlived the individual who discovered it. That pattern is about to show up again. This time not in bone, but in the plants ancient healers reached for every single day. Long before anyone wrote a single medical text, plants were already doing quiet, measurable work inside the human body. And the evidence for it is preserved in the least glamorous place imaginable: fossilized plaque. Researchers examining the teeth of Neanderthals at sites in Europe have found dental calculus, essentially ancient tartar, containing traces of plants like yarrow and groundsel. Neither tastes good. Neither was a food source. Both happen to have documented medicinal properties still recognized in herbal traditions today. This wasn't modern Homo sapiens. This was a different human species entirely, chewing on bitter plants for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger, tens of thousands of years before Egypt, before writing, before anything we'd call civilization. By the time civilization does show up, the sophistication is almost startling. The Ebers Papyrus, an Egyptian medical text compiled around 1550 BCE but drawing on knowledge far older, lists over 700 remedies. Treatments for infection, inflammation, digestive trouble, eye disease, even what we'd now recognize as psychological distress. And a surprising number of these remedies actually hold up. Honey shows up constantly in Egyptian wound care, and modern microbiology explains exactly why. Its low moisture content, acidity, and natural hydrogen peroxide production create an environment bacteria simply can't survive in. Nobody in ancient Egypt knew what a bacterium was. They just noticed over and over that wounds packed with honey healed cleaner than wounds left alone, and they kept doing it. Garlic, consumed in huge quantities by the laborers who built the pyramids, carries real antibacterial and antifungal compounds. Willow bark, used for pain and fever, contains a compound chemically close to aspirin. None of this was luck repeated 700 times. It was millennia of watching what worked and discarding what didn't, one patient at a time. Then there's a discovery that borders on unbelievable. Traces of mold have turned up in ancient Egyptian medical preparations applied directly to infected wounds, mold from the same family that produces penicillin. 2,000 years before Alexander Fleming noticed bacteria dying around a stray mold spore in his lab and won a Nobel Prize for it, someone in ancient Egypt had already noticed the same thing happening on a bandage and started doing it on purpose. But understanding why any of this worked was still nowhere close. The dominant medical theories of the ancient world weren't just incomplete, they were often flatly wrong. The Greeks believed illness came from an imbalance among four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that restoring balance meant draining the excess. That single idea kept bloodletting as standard medical practice for over 2,000 years, and it likely killed far more people than it ever saved. Other cultures built entirely different frameworks: vital energy pathways in China, the doshas of Ayurvedic medicine in India. All different, all confident, all in the mechanical sense incorrect. Here's the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Germ theory, the basic idea that microorganisms cause disease, wasn't established until the 1860s. Not ancient history. Barely a century and a half ago. For every single year of human existence before that point, every healer on every continent was treating illness with zero knowledge of what was actually causing it. And yet the remedies kept working anyway, because ancient healers weren't really operating as theorists. They were operating as empiricists. Wrong model, right result, purely by relentless repetition of whatever produced survivors. That empiricism didn't stop in the ancient world either. A 9th century Anglo-Saxon manuscript known as Bald's Leech Book contains a remedy for eye infections calling for garlic, onion, wine, and bile from a cow's stomach, left to steep in a brass vessel for several days. It reads like folklore. In 2015, researchers at the University of Nottingham decided to recreate it exactly as written and test it in a lab. It killed MRSA, one of the most dangerous antibiotic-resistant bacteria in modern medicine, at rates comparable to some contemporary treatments. A 1,000-year-old recipe with no understanding of bacteria at all, quietly outperforming expectations in a 21st century lab. None of these healers could see a single microbe, but they could see a wound closing, a fever breaking, a patient walking out instead of being carried out. And piece by piece, without ever knowing the mechanism, they built something that functioned like science long before anyone had a word for it. Knowledge alone wasn't enough to keep people alive. It needed a system to carry it, and nowhere is that clearer than in the Roman military. The Roman army maintained trained medics, functioning field hospitals, and surgeons who specialized in extracting arrowheads, closing wounds, and managing infection on a battlefield. Not because Rome was especially compassionate, but because a dead soldier is a strategic loss. Necessity built one of the most advanced trauma care systems the ancient world had ever seen, and its techniques remained the standard for roughly 1,000 years after the empire itself collapsed. But surviving in the ancient world was never really an individual achievement. Humans are, biologically speaking, poorly equipped to make it alone. No claws, no armor. Slow to mature, and dangerously dependent on others when sick or hurt. For most of human history, if you got seriously injured, you survived because someone else showed up with knowledge and stayed with you. Shamans, midwives, herbalists, specialists holding a tradition built from real observation, even when the theory behind it was wrong. Community wasn't just comforting, it was functionally a form of treatment. Isolation slows recovery. Ancient people didn't need a study to know that. They watched it happen. None of this means it was gentle. Before modern obstetrics, giving birth carried a real chance of death, somewhere between 1 and 3% per delivery, which sounds small until you remember most women gave birth multiple times across a life. Roughly half of children in many ancient societies didn't survive to age 5. Sepsis, a runaway infection in the bloodstream, was nearly always fatal once it took hold, and there was nothing anyone could do except keep the patient warm, hydrated, and not alone. Sometimes the body's own defenses won anyway. Ancient medicine couldn't fix everything, but it could stack the odds even slightly, and slightly was often the entire difference between a name remembered and a name forgotten. Here's the part that should genuinely change how you see your own medicine cabinet. A large share of modern pharmaceuticals either come directly from plants or are synthetic copies of compounds first identified in them. The World Health Organization estimates that roughly 80% of people on Earth today still rely primarily on plant-based medicine for basic healthcare, not out of tradition alone, but because it works. Aspirin traces back to willow bark, morphine to the opium poppy. Quinine, which has saved countless lives from malaria, came from cinchona bark used by South American communities long before it was ever written down by outsiders. Artemisinin, one of the most effective malaria treatments in use today, was pulled from sweet wormwood after 2,000 years of use in Chinese medicine. Digoxin, prescribed for heart failure, comes from foxglove. Taxol, a critical cancer treatment, from the Pacific yew tree. Vincristine, used against childhood leukemia, from a flower used in Madagascar's traditional medicine. None of that knowledge appeared overnight. It was built the same way it always had been, through decades and centuries of watching, testing, failing, and remembering, passed hand to hand until it finally reached a modern laboratory willing to isolate the compound and put a name to it. So the next time a headache sends you toward the medicine cabinet, know what you're actually holding. Not a shortcut around history, but the end product of it. Every pill is the final link in a chain that runs back through Roman field surgeons, Egyptian healers packing honey into wounds, Neanderthals chewing bitter bark in a cave, and countless people whose names were never recorded, all trying to solve the exact same problem you had this morning. They just had to solve it the hard way first so you wouldn't have to.